So next we have Dr. Karen Foster. And Karen, where are you? Do you have slides, Karen? Okay, good, good, okay. So I've been told to abbreviate the bios. So Dr. Karen Foster is Professor of Sociology and Associate Dean in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at Dalhousie, where she holds the Canada Research Chair in Sustainable Rural Futures. And she will probably tell you lots more about the current initiatives that she's taking.
Okay. Thank you, Linda. Yes, and I should clarify that I used to hold that research chair, and it just ended in May. Not because I did anything wrong, but because I did both of my terms, and it's over now. So I have been asked to talk to you about how stronger connections can create shared priorities across health, agriculture, environment, education, and the economy. And I'm going. I know. I think I'm going to do it. I want to approach this from two angles. The first is a systems perspective on the problems we face, and the second is some practical lessons from building a research network that's intended to connect people across sectors. And so I'll start with the systems piece, which is going to be, I think, a little bit repetitive from what you've already heard, which I've come around to seeing it as a good thing. When you said polycrisis, I was mad at you for a minute, but I actually think it's good if you hear this a couple times. So I'll talk about the systems piece, and then just before you fall asleep, I'm going to move into the lived experience of trying to put these ideas into practice. So I'm not sure if you've noticed, but there's a lot happening in the world right now. I know. You've already heard a list already, but we've got rising, let's call them geopolitical tensions, climate-driven disasters, concentrated corporate power, we all saw that slide in the first talk this morning, and rapidly advancing technologies. And all of these things together kind of make ordinary people feel like they have very little ability to protect themselves or their communities. Governments are acting too slowly. And major corporations often seem to set the terms of our collective future. And I'll add billionaires to that as well. So people feel vulnerable, and they're asking fundamental questions, particularly as we face these crises. Do we produce enough food to feed ourselves? Can we move it where it's needed? Clearly, we're not doing that very well right now. Will our energy grid hold? Can we evacuate people when we need to? Are our communication systems reliable and protected? Can we defend our borders if we have to? And if something goes wrong, will everyone be cared for equitably? These questions aren't really about any single sector. They are about the systems that sustain us and our natural world. They're about the resources we depend on and whether those systems are resilient enough for the world that we now inhabit. And what's frustrating is the way that it seems like systems and challenges interlock and make it impossible to change one thing without changing everything, even though that is probably what we need to do, is change everything. So the idea of the polycrisis captures this sense that our challenges are no longer isolated. For example, problems in agriculture are tied to chronic disinvestment from rural communities. That's one of my interests, is this link between producing food and sustaining rural communities. That disinvestment is connected to labor shortages linked to supply chain fragility gets exposed by storms and floods and pandemics or trade disruptions. So polycrisis theorists argue that we need to understand the world's conjoined crises as a whole. They describe polycrisis as a single macro crisis in which natural and social systems experience runaway interconnected failures. Long-term stresses like decades of underinvestment in rural infrastructure, for example, interact with acute triggers like a 100-year flood or a pandemic, and they push systems out of disequilibrium, or out of equilibrium. And over time, they use this metaphor of the basin. So the basin that systems sit in become shallower, and then one shock can tip everything over. And I think that's not a bad metaphor for how many of us feel right now. Like we are kind of depleted, systems and resources are depleted, and we have very little margin left. But the whole framework of polycrisis also helps us visualize how systems and triggers and crises intersect, which is the first step toward identifying where we might most effectively intervene. Polycrisis scholarship suggests that no single discipline or sector can navigate these interlocked challenges alone. Addressing complex systems requires diverse teams, drawing on lived experience, community knowledge, academic research, and practical expertise. So that sounds straightforward in theory. In practice, it can feel like being told, you can't do just one thing, you have to do everything. But as others have said, what it really means is that you have to collaborate. And this is part of what motivated me in a group of, at first, 49 academics from 13 institutions and 22 nonprofits to create the Common Ground Network, which I'll tell you a little bit about. And we've structured that network around relationships within systems and between them. And at this point, we're like just over 2 years into the network, and we've grown to around 200 academic members and hundreds of community, provincial, and national organizations as partners. So in our original proposal, we described a frustration that was shared among scholars and community partners, which is that we've heard it here today. We know what to do. We've arrived at solutions. There's an understanding of what needs to be done. But we hit a wall because something in the broader system isn't aligned. So, for example, we know what health interventions are needed to make people healthier, but they fail because there's inequities that block their implementation. Indeed, we just talked about that with access to locally grown food. It's not enough just to be able to find it. You have to be able to afford it as well. Or a food safety recommendation might run into jurisdictional conflict. I think anybody who produces food knows that those levels of regulation aren't always aligned. Or local procurement gets stonewalled because it contravenes free trade or something like that. So our aim in the network was to focus on social relations, how different parts of the food system, agricultural systems, communities, and governance structures interact. And we organized our work around 4 relational pillars, we call them. That's the kind of the buckets that were, you concerned about this? Thank you. Okay. So we've got these 4 relational pillars, people and land, people in/and the food system, urban-rural relations, and Canada and the world. And then we also created 2 cross-cutting teams, an Indigenous Circles team and an evaluation team to ensure that that their knowledge flows across the whole network. And these pieces have all taken time to develop and different lengths of time, each of them, but that's part of the work. And one of our biggest early challenges was simply trying not to reproduce the silos that we were trying to break down. And I think that's kind of a common challenge when you're trying to collaborate, is that there's a reason why we've developed silos over time, or basically developed like a bureaucratic structure, is that there's so much work to do that we've divided it up. We were trying to divide people in these kind of newfangled categories, and that was difficult because there's so much overlap. So dividing people by discipline or region or topic would have been easier and kind of less negotiable, but it also would have reinforced the boundaries that we were trying to make more permeable. So we have lived with the messy overlap between these pillars, and we've embraced it. So one consequence was that we all kind of went away into our separate pillars to decide what topics we were going to pursue, and two of them came back and said food hubs, and we had to be like, okay, I guess that's actually okay, because you can approach the same problem from different perspectives and end up with a different result. So we've embraced that. Across all pillars, we've established two core rules. The first is that every research project that we do should have a community partner. So we're really trying to make sure that academics are working with community practitioners and actors. And most of these partners are operating at the community, like local level, which I'll come back to. The second principle that we've tried to build into everything we do is that resources should flow to where they have the most impact, which usually means supporting community-based research assistance or helping nonprofit partners attend events that would otherwise be inaccessible, or using a research assistantship to actually fund part of a community partner's work. So this is what facilitating connection, I think, looks like in practice. We've also been working to strengthen connections with government. So Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada co-founded our project, and we made a commitment to stay engaged with them, not just occasionally, but regularly and meaningfully. And it hasn't always been straightforward. So there are long-standing gaps between research and policy, and between community advocates and civil servants. And to bridge these, we started a brown bag discussion series, so informal virtual sessions where network members, which are, like I said, it's like half academics who study food systems and half community partners, can present to Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada staff and answer questions. And the first session was rocky. It was kind of a flop. We were asked ahead of time to avoid academic jargon and anything that sounded political. So we weren't allowed to say neoliberalism, and we weren't allowed to say hegemony. And then one of our members said neoliberalism within like 5 minutes, and I could see the civil servants just kind of shutting off. But we regrouped, we tried again, we didn't let it fail. So we debriefed, we refined the format. Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada agreed to provide advanced questions so that we weren't just kind of like feeling around in the dark for what kinds of things they might want to know. We prepared the speakers differently. And the second session was significantly more productive. And we even held a dedicated session last week on talking to AAFC. So it was just like training researchers on what civil servants can and can't do, and what kind of information might be useful to them. And so that's what connection building looks like. It's iterative, it's imperfect, it's improved through mutual learning. It's also not, I should say, highly incentivized in academia. And so Stephen's point earlier about how collective organizing is kind of done off the side of your desk really resonated with me, in that running a network it takes up a lot of time. And as a result, I'm not writing papers, and I'm supposed to be. So I'm kind of trying to also embrace that this is still impactful work, but it's not really recognized, as part of my job. And I think that's probably true for a lot of us. So looking ahead, the Common Ground Network is committed to strengthening communication across languages, provinces, disciplines, and sectors. All of our webinars and conferences now include simultaneous interpretation so that Francophone and Anglophone scholars can participate equally. And we recently hosted a webinar that was focused entirely on Francophone researchers. So the whole thing was translated for Anglophones to ensure that the work that's happening in Quebec is visible and accessible in the rest of the country. We're also planning a food systems assembly for June 2026 in Orillia, Ontario, bringing together the Canadian Association for Food Studies, Food Secure Canada, the Food Communities Network, and the Common Ground Network for the first time ever. It's more complex than running separate events. There are compromises being made everywhere, but the shared platform feels like what this moment calls for. So I just wanted to share a little bit of that experience of trying to do this collaborative work, and I guess reinforce that it's difficult, but it has impact, and that it's messy, but it's worth doing. And before I close, I just want to emphasize that none of this devalues local action. In fact, it depends on it. I recently sat on a panel about community prosperity, and I shared my belief that in a world where global forces feel overwhelming, people will increasingly turn towards localism out of necessity and out of a desire to feel empowered. Wendell Berry, I feel like there's probably some Wendell Berry fans in here, wrote about this in the early 2000s, among other times, and he argued that when global economic shifts threaten livelihoods, communities, and the environment, the one real defense that ordinary people have is to build local economies. And local economies for Berry are grounded in the principles of neighborhood and subsistence. And so he explains that by saying that in a viable neighborhood, people ask what they can provide for one another and answer that within the limits of what their place can sustain. And subsistence means meeting local needs first before looking to export. And Berry noted that communities often begin this local economy work with food. And I know that those of you in this room know that the global food system that we're in just encourages the opposite of neighborhood and subsistence. And that's why it's unsustainable and unjust and productivist. So I think Berry was right that global change is so slow and difficult that many people either burn out or turn inward. But at the local level, people can actually get things done. You can see who needs what. You can understand conflicts and work through them. You can build trust. And I was thinking that a lot of our political disagreements now are about redistribution. Like how do we divide up the wealth of society, and who do we have an obligation to take care of? And I think that you can fight with your uncle about that at the Thanksgiving table, or you can fight with a stranger online, but at the local level, it seems like we just want to get stuff done. Like it's much easier to get people to care. So I think that it's at the local scale that the idea that all boats rise together actually can have meaning. I think when you get further up, it really doesn't work. So I've talked a lot about these massive interconnected systems and the need for teams that can see the whole, but none of that works without deep local knowledge and action. And so I think the challenge before us is to support each other as part of the same broad system, and to connect wherever possible across sectors and regions and perspectives and lived experiences. And I think that some of us will work at that level of synthesis and systems analysis because it is a full-time job. Others will work at the level of community-based action and advocacy, but those roles depend on each other. And it depends on, us coming together in these kinds of events. Systems thinking without local insight is too abstract. Local action without broader context becomes isolated. The power really is in connection, in building relationships that allow knowledge to flow upward and downward and across all of these various spaces where we work. And those stronger connections are how we will ultimately build shared priorities across health, agriculture, environment, education, and the economy. I will leave it at that. Thank you.
For your research and everything that you do, and I'm wondering how you did it, how you went about getting all your collaborators together.
Yeah, so the whole thing originated with an opportunity from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, SSHRC. So they put out a call for the development of a research network that was focused on sustainable agriculture in a net zero economy. And so I pulled together a team that wanted to work on that, and it was funny because I think there were a few people who were interested in applying but really didn't want to lead it. So I met with other teams where there were kind of reluctant leaders who just surrendered their people over to my application. And then we were selected. So we are so fortunate to have a lot of funding for the initiative. I wish that there was the same level of investment in just community based networks. But I do think that using the academic network as a way of filtering money into the community based stuff is the next best thing. And in terms of building, it's been a lot of actual networking, getting people to invite their networks to join the network. and making sure that we're not like rebuilding networks that actually exist already. So the hundreds of community partners, a big chunk of them are coming from just one key partnership with the Food Communities Network, who approached me and said, we're already doing this on the community side. Like, don't rebuild what we're doing, just, make a partnership with us. And there have been a few instances of that where we're just like combining networks. They still exist independently, but for the work that we're doing, we're combining.
So you were just talking about using academia to leverage some sort of funds into the work, but there's a lot of resources that are needed, and I'm wondering if among your network, is that a discussion that's happening? Is not just like what is needed, but how can we make it happen, and get the resources, and is there any philanthropy in your network? And if not,
yeah,
hook me up.
I think as an academic that's so critical of wealth inequality, it's not the first place I look. But I do think that there's a lot of philanthropy that's very interested in this kind of work, that has the same goals. So totally open to that. We're applying for other grants, basically. So for the Francophone work, we have decided to barge ahead with it, even though we aren't sure we can afford simultaneous interpretation, because we're like, we'll figure it out, we'll get the money somewhere. So we have applied for another grant just for simultaneous interpretation, and we can take a few kicks at that but among us, because there's so many academics, we can apply for grants like ad nauseum. There's no reason why we can't just get more funding.
Yeah, about that poly crisis. No, I really, so many things you said resonated. The difficulties and the opportunities, just the issue of trust alone, how critical it is to build and how much easier things are once trust is actually there. But that's a huge investment in that in itself. And I really also, there's a number of things I really liked. I'd like to hear more at some point. But that idea of that connection to local, and in many ways, if there was a way through something, that we could do a much better job of grabbing these local experiences and communicating those into the policy realm in a less fragmented way, and at least make sure they get up there. I think it'd be very interesting, but well done. I thought, we'll talk about the poly crisis later.
Okay, great.
You said that the civil servants that you're working with AAFC aren't allowed to use the word neoliberalism. I was just at the UNFAO a few weeks ago, and a few folks came up to me and said that you can't use the word sovereignty with them, which is wild. But I'm curious, what kind of language have you found when dealing with AAFC that is neoliberal adjacent, when we're calling out the obvious key root cause of so many of these problems?
We have a very good contact there who is telling us what her colleagues will and will not find value in. And so we're trying not to bristle at that, trying to work with it. And I would say we're still working on it. I think a frustration that I have that is not their fault, but it's limiting this, is that they have a very clear sense at AAFC of what's in and what's outside of their mandate. And so us taking this systems and relational perspective actually doesn't work very well, because they're sort of like, well, we can't do anything about that. We can't do anything about education. We can't do anything about, hospitals. And I don't think there's any mechanism that allows them to think in that systems way. But we've been encouraged that, like, if we just push the ideas out, they'll filter into the minds of the civil servants, and maybe they'll start thinking differently. But I do think we need, like, at the level of the federal government, there have to be more of those mechanisms. We can't even get fisheries to talk to agriculture. Fisheries wanted to, and agriculture was like, don't invite them. So, yeah, it's baked right into the bureaucracy.